Hey there, friend. Welcome to another quiet journey through the dusty corridors of ancient history. Tonight, we're settling in for something a little different, a little darker perhaps, but told in that gentle way that lets your mind wander as your body finds rest. Whether it's the middle of the night where you are, or you're winding down from a long day, I'm glad you've joined me for this exploration into biblical times. Before we begin our journey back 3,000 years, take a moment to like this video if you find these historical tales soothing, and subscribe if you enjoy drifting off to the whispered stories of ages past. I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, finding peace in these ancient stories. Now, settle back into your pillows, let your breathing slow, and allow me to transport you to a world so different from ours that it might as well be another planet. Tonight, we're exploring the harsh realities of justice in biblical times, when punishment wasn't about rehabilitation or fines or community service. No, in the ancient Near East, justice was swift, public, and often shockingly brutal by today's standards. Picture, if you will, the dusty streets of ancient Jerusalem. The sun beats down mercilessly on limestone walls, casting sharp shadows where merchants hawk their wares and children play in the dirt. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense, roasting meat, and unfortunately, human suffering. Because in this world, punishment wasn't something that happened behind closed doors in sterile institutions. It was theatre, spectacle, a warning written in flesh and blood for all to see. Let's start with something that might surprise you. In our modern world, when someone commits a crime, we have elaborate systems, police investigations, lawyers, judges, juries, appeals processes that can stretch for years. We have the presumption of innocence, the right to remain silent, constitutional protections that would seem like magical concepts to someone from biblical times. But 3,000 years ago, justice moved at the speed of stone tablets and angry crowds. If you were caught stealing, the punishment might be decided and carried out before the sun set that same day. There were no lengthy trials, no psychological evaluations, no consideration of your troubled childhood or socio-economic circumstances. There was the law, there was the offense, and there was the consequence, swift and certain. The biblical world operated on what scholars call lex talionis, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, as it's written in Exodus. Now, we often think of this as primitive, barbaric even, but in its time, it was actually a form of mercy, a limitation on revenge. Before this principle, if someone knocked out your tooth, you might kill their entire family. The biblical law said no, the punishment must fit the crime, it must be proportional. But what did this proportional justice look like in practice? Let's take theft, something we deal with in our modern world through fines, maybe some jail time, perhaps community service. In biblical times, if you stole a sheep, you didn't just return the sheep. Oh no, that would be far too simple. According to the law in Exodus, you had to pay back 4 sheep for every one you stole, steal an ox, and you owed 5 oxen in return. Now imagine you're a poor farmer who steals a single sheep to feed your starving family. Under biblical law, you now owe 4 sheep, but you were already so poor you had to steal to survive. How exactly are you supposed to come up with 4 sheep? This is where the system becomes truly harsh. If you couldn't pay, you could be sold into slavery to work off your debt. Your freedom, your family, your entire life could be forfeit for one moment of desperate hunger. Compare this to today. If someone steals a sheep, well, first of all, sheep theft isn't exactly a common crime in our urban world. But if someone steals property worth, say, $500, they might face a misdemeanor charge, some fines, maybe a few days in jail if they have a record. They keep their job, their family, their place in society. The punishment, while unpleasant, doesn't destroy their entire existence. But let's move beyond simple theft to more serious crimes. In our modern justice system, we have degrees of murder, manslaughter, justifiable homicide. We consider intent, circumstances, mental state. A crime of passion is treated differently than premeditated murder. We have plea bargains, reduced sentences, parole boards. In biblical times, murder was murder, and the punishment was death. But not the relatively quick and painless methods we use today. Lethal injection administered in a sterile room, with medical professionals ensuring minimal suffering. No, biblical execution was public, brutal, and designed to serve as a deterrent to others. Stoning was perhaps the most common method of execution, and it's worth understanding what this actually involved. The condemned person would be taken outside the city because death made a place ritually unclean. They would be thrown into a pit or forced to stand in a designated area. Then the community, starting with the witnesses to the crime, would hurl stones at them until they died. This wasn't a quick process. The stones used weren't massive boulders that would kill instantly. They were hand-sized rocks that would break bones, cause internal bleeding, crush organs slowly. The condemned might linger for quite some time, conscious and suffering, while their neighbours, people they'd known their entire lives, threw stones at their bleeding body. Can you imagine the psychological trauma this would cause, not just to the condemned, but to the community forced to participate? Children would watch their parents throw stones. Parents would explain to their little ones why Uncle David had to die this way. The entire social fabric was woven through with violence in a way that's almost incomprehensible to us today, and yet this public nature of punishment served a purpose that our private institutional justice system sometimes struggles with. Everyone in the community knew exactly what happened to those who broke the law. There was no mystery, no rumours, no conspiracy theories about whether justice was truly served. The consequences were visible, immediate, and unforgettable. Consider how different this is from our modern approach. When someone commits a serious crime today, they disappear into the prison system, out of sight, out of mind. Most of us never think about what actually happens to criminals after they're sentenced. They vanish into an abstract system of concrete and steel, becoming statistics rather than cautionary tales. But perhaps even more alien to our modern sensibilities were the biblical laws around what we'd now call civil disputes. If your neighbour's ox gored your donkey, if someone's fire spread to your field, if a business deal went wrong, these weren't matters for small claims court. They were handled by the elders at the city gate, and the punishments could be swift and harsh. Let's say you falsely accuse someone of a crime. Today, you might face perjury charges, maybe some jail time if it was particularly egregious. In biblical times, under the law of false witnesses, you would receive exactly the punishment your victim would have received if your lie had been believed. Falsely accuse someone of murder, and you yourself would be executed. Falsely accuse someone of theft, and you'd pay the penalty for theft. This created a society where your word carried enormous weight, where lying wasn't just morally wrong, but potentially fatal. People thought very carefully before making accusations, knowing that if they couldn't prove their claims, they might suffer the very fate they'd tried to inflict on others. The biblical world was also one where certain crimes weren't just offences against individuals, but against the cosmic order itself. Adultery, for instance, wasn't seen as a private matter between spouses. It was a violation of divine law that threatened the stability of society itself. And the punishment reflected this cosmic significance. Both the man and woman caught in adultery were to be stoned to death. Not just the woman, as popular misconceptions sometimes suggest, but both parties. Though, as with many aspects of ancient law, The wealthy and powerful often found ways to avoid these consequences. It was the poor, the powerless, the friendless who felt the full weight of biblical justice. Compare this to our modern approach to adultery. In most places today, it's not a crime at all. It might be grounds for divorce, might affect custody or property settlements. But no one's going to prison, let alone facing execution. We've separated religious or moral offences from legal ones in ways that would seem incomprehensible to biblical communities. But perhaps most disturbing to our modern sensibilities were the punishments for religious offences. Blasphemy, idol worship, working on the Sabbath. These could all be capital crimes. The story of the man who gathered sticks on the Sabbath, found in Numbers, illustrates this perfectly. The community wasn't sure what to do with him, so they asked God directly. The answer came back clear: stone him to death. Imagine being executed for collecting firewood on the wrong day of the week. Yet this harsh approach to religious law reflects something important about biblical society. These weren't just rules imposed by human authority. They were understood as direct commands from the divine, and violating them threatened not just social order but the relationship between the community and God. As we drift deeper into this ancient world, let your mind wander through these dusty streets where justice was swift and mercy was rare. Picture the city gates where elders sat in judgment, the public squares where punishments were carried out, the homes where families lived, knowing that a single mistake could destroy everything they held dear. The punishments of biblical times seem harsh to us because we live in a world of second chances, rehabilitation programs, and constitutional rights. But for the people of that time, living on the edge of survival in a world full of dangers we can barely imagine, harsh justice was often the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. As your eyelids grow heavy and your breathing slows, remember that these ancient stories aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders of how far we've come in our understanding of justice, mercy, and human dignity. They're also reminders of how precious our modern protections really are, and how quickly they could disappear if we're not vigilant in protecting them. Sleep now, knowing that you live in a time and place where justice moves slowly and carefully, where punishment aims to reform rather than simply punish, where mercy is built into the very fabric of our legal system. Rest easy in the knowledge that while the ancient world was harsh and unforgiving, we've learned to build something better, something more humane. But our journey into biblical justice has only just begun. Tomorrow night, we'll explore the specific punishments for different crimes, the role of judges and witnesses, and the fascinating ways that ancient communities tried to balance justice with mercy in a world where both were precious commodities. For now, let these ancient voices fade into whispers. Let the dust of Jerusalem settle, and let sleep carry you away from this harsh world into the gentle embrace of dreams. As we reach the end of our journey through the romantic wasteland of medieval times, we must confront one final, devastating truth about love in this era. Even death could not end the suffering. For those few couples who managed to find genuine affection despite all the obstacles we've explored, who survived the accusations of witchcraft, the threat of violence, the constant surveillance, and the crushing weight of social expectation, death was not a merciful release, but often the beginning of an even crueler separation. Medieval beliefs about the afterlife created their own special torment for lovers. The Church taught that earthly love, no matter how pure, was always secondary to divine love. A widow who mourned her husband too deeply, who showed too much grief, or refused to remarry quickly enough, might be suspected of placing human affection above proper Christian devotion. The very intensity of romantic love that we now celebrate as beautiful was seen as evidence of spiritual corruption. Consider the plight of Eleanor, a merchant's wife in 14th century London. When her husband William died of plague, she was expected to mourn appropriately, but not excessively. Too little grief, and she would be seen as cold, unnatural. Too much, and she risked accusations of idolatry, of loving a mortal man more than God. The church prescribed exact periods of mourning, specific prayers to be said, particular garments to be worn. Even in her sorrow, Eleanor's emotions were regulated, controlled, monitored by a society that viewed passionate love as inherently dangerous. The medieval understanding of purgatory added another layer of torment to grieving lovers. Those who died were believed to suffer in purgatory for years or even centuries, paying for the sins of their earthly lives. A surviving spouse was expected to arrange masses, pay for prayers, commission religious artwork, all to reduce their beloved's suffering in the afterlife. But here's the cruel irony. The very love that made them want to help their deceased partner was seen as potentially sinful. Too much effort to ease a spouse's purgatorial suffering might be interpreted as excessive attachment to earthly relationships. Medieval ghost stories, which were remarkably common, often featured lovers who returned from the dead not to comfort but to warn. These spectral visitations were usually interpreted as evidence that the deceased was suffering, that their earthly attachments were preventing them from finding peace in the afterlife. A woman who dreamed of her dead husband wasn't experiencing a comforting reunion, but potentially a sign that both of them were spiritually compromised. The practice of memorializing the dead created additional burdens for surviving lovers. Wealthy families could commission elaborate tomb sculptures, stained glass windows, or religious manuscripts to honor their deceased. But even these monuments to love were constrained by religious and social expectations. The imagery had to be properly Christian, the inscriptions appropriately pious. A widow couldn't simply celebrate her husband's love. She had to frame it within acceptable religious context, demonstrating that her grief was properly subordinated to divine will. For the poor, even basic burial became a source of romantic anguish. Without money for proper funeral rites, without connections to ensure appropriate prayers, a surviving lover might spend their remaining years tormented by the belief that their beloved was suffering in purgatory because they couldn't afford to help them. Love, which should have been a source of comfort in grief, became instead a source of guilt and spiritual anxiety. The remarriage expectations placed on widows created particularly cruel dilemmas. A woman was expected to remarry quickly, both for economic survival and to avoid the suspicion that came with independent living. But remarrying too quickly suggested that her previous marriage hadn't been based on proper affection. Waiting too long indicated dangerous attachment to earthly love. There was no correct choice, no way to honor both practical necessity and emotional truth. Medieval medical understanding made even the physical process of grief dangerous. Excessive mourning was believed to cause actual illness, to unbalance the humours and invite disease. A widow who became ill from grief might be told that her sickness was punishment for loving too much, for failing to accept God's will with proper resignation. The very act of mourning deeply became evidence of spiritual failure. The children of these relationships faced their own romantic doom. Medieval belief in hereditary sin meant that the spiritual corruption of excessive parental love could be passed down through generations. A child whose parents had loved each other too passionately might be seen as inheriting that spiritual weakness, making them unsuitable for certain marriages or religious vocations. Even successful love could damn future generations. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life meant that death often came at times that maximized romantic suffering. Plague typically struck in summer, war campaigns were launched in spring, childbirth complications peaked in winter. A lover might die just as the relationship was flourishing, just as children were being born, just as plans for the future were taking shape. The timing seemed designed to cause maximum heartbreak. The limited communication systems of medieval times meant that news of death often came weeks or months after the fact. A merchant's wife might spend months wondering why her husband's letters had stopped coming, hoping for his return, only to learn eventually that he had died alone in a foreign city weeks before. The prolonged uncertainty, the false hope, the delayed grief created a particular kind of romantic torture that our instant communication age can barely comprehend. Even successful medieval marriages were shadowed by the knowledge that they would likely end in tragedy. With average lifespans so short, with disease and violence so common, couples couldn't enjoy the luxury of assuming they would grow old together. Every day of happiness was tinged with the awareness that it might be the last. This constant awareness of mortality didn't make love more precious. It made it more desperate, more anxious, more prone to the very intensity that medieval society found so threatening. The religious art of the period reflects this complicated relationship between love, death, and spiritual danger. Medieval churches are filled with images of separated lovers, of earthly attachments being severed by divine will, of the saved ascending to heaven while leaving their earthly relationships behind. These weren't meant to be tragic. They were meant to be instructional, reminding viewers that human love was always temporary and potentially corrupting. The few love letters that survive from the medieval period are heartbreaking in their awareness of this doom. Medieval lovers wrote to each other with the knowledge that their correspondence might be interrupted at any moment by death, by separation, by social condemnation. Their words carry the weight of people who knew they were stealing moments of happiness from a world determined to deny them joy. As we conclude this exploration of medieval dating nightmares, we're left with a profound appreciation for how far human society has come in recognizing love as a basic human right rather than a dangerous luxury. The medieval lovers we've encountered throughout this series faced obstacles that seem almost unimaginable today. Systematic surveillance, supernatural persecution, legal inequality, medical ignorance, religious oppression, and social control that extended even beyond death. Their courage in loving anyway, in finding moments of tenderness and connection despite overwhelming opposition, represents some of the most profound heroism in human history. They fought not against external enemies, but against the very structure of their society, against beliefs and institutions designed to crush the human spirit. When we complain about modern dating apps, about ghosting, about the challenges of finding compatible partners in our busy world, we should remember the medieval couples who faced accusations of witchcraft for holding hands, who risked execution for choosing their own spouses, who endured separation by death, knowing that even their grief would be regulated and judged. The nightmare of medieval dating was not just about individual suffering, but about the systematic attempt to control and suppress one of humanity's most fundamental needs: the need for love, connection, and companionship. It was about societies that saw romantic happiness as dangerous, that treated human affection as a threat to social order, that preferred loveless marriages to genuine partnerships. Yet even in that darkness, love persisted. People continued to fall in love, to risk everything for moments of happiness, to choose connection over safety. Their stories, fragmentary and often tragic as they are, remind us that the human capacity for love is stronger than any social system designed to suppress it. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in a world where you're free to love whom you choose, where marriage is based on mutual affection rather than political arrangement, where romantic relationships are generally seen as sources of joy rather than spiritual danger, spare a thought for those medieval lovers who paved the way with their courage, their sacrifice, and their refusal to let the darkness extinguish their capacity for love. The nightmare of medieval dating is over. The dawn of romantic freedom, though still imperfect, has broken. And love, despite everything that was done to destroy it, has survived to see the light. Rest now in the knowledge that their struggles were not in vain, that their love, however brief and troubled, helped create the world where love can flourish. Sleep peacefully and dream of a future where love faces no such obstacles, where every heart can find its match, and where the only battles lovers need fight are the gentle ones of learning to understand each other better. The medieval nightmare is ended. Love has won. Medieval authorities understood that controlling love meant controlling people. Every stolen kiss, every whispered promise, every gentle touch between unmarried souls was scrutinized through the cold lens of Christian doctrine. The Church had transformed human sexuality from a natural expression of affection into a carefully regulated sacrament, hedged about with so many restrictions and prohibitions that even married couples lived in constant fear of spiritual damnation. Consider the plight of young Willem, a merchant's son in 14th century Bruges. He had fallen deeply in love with Marguerite, the baker's daughter, and she with him. Their courtship, if it could be called that, consisted of carefully chaperoned encounters after Sunday Mass, always under the watchful eyes of her mother and the village priest. Even holding hands was considered scandalous. A kiss, should they dare attempt one, would require immediate confession and penance. The Church taught that sexual desire, even within marriage, was inherently sinful unless performed solely for procreation. Young couples were instructed to approach physical intimacy with shame and reluctance, never pleasure. The prescribed position was missionary in darkness, with minimal contact and maximum spiritual anguish. Any deviation from this joyless coupling was considered evidence of demonic influence. Willem and Marguerite's families eventually arranged their marriage, but even their wedding night was governed by ecclesiastical law. They could not consummate their union on Sundays, holy days, feast days, fast days, during Lent, during Advent, or during Marguerite's monthly courses. When they calculated all the prohibited times, they discovered they were permitted marital relations for perhaps 40 days per year. The Church's control extended far beyond the bedroom into every aspect of romantic life. Young people were forbidden from expressing affection publicly, writing love letters, or even speaking alone together. Dancing was viewed with deep suspicion, as it might inflame carnal desires. Music, poetry, and art that celebrated earthly love rather than divine devotion were considered dangerous corruptions that could lead souls astray. Religious authorities actively discouraged romantic attachment between spouses, teaching that excessive love for one's husband or wife was a form of spiritual adultery that displaced proper devotion to God. Couples were expected to care for each other's physical needs and procreate, but passionate love was seen as a threat to salvation. The enforcement of these restrictions was brutal and comprehensive. Church courts had jurisdiction over all matters relating to marriage, sexuality, and family life. Couples accused of premarital relations faced public humiliation, heavy fines, and severe penance. Women bore the brunt of this punishment, as they were considered both more susceptible to temptation and more responsible for leading men astray. Even within marriage, the Church monitored intimate relationships with disturbing thoroughness. Priests conducted regular inquiries into couples' private lives, asking detailed questions about their sexual practices, frequency of relations, and emotional attachment to each other. Any sign of excessive passion or deviation from prescribed norms could result in accusations of moral corruption or demonic possession. The sacrament of confession became a tool of sexual surveillance. Young people were required to detail their romantic thoughts and desires to celibate priests who often had little understanding of human sexuality. These confessions were sometimes shared with family members or used as evidence in ecclesiastical courts, turning the most intimate aspects of human experience into weapons of social control. Religious festivals and holy days, which might have provided opportunities for courtship and celebration, were instead occasions for increased vigilance and restriction. Young people were watched more closely during these times, as the church feared that religious ecstasy might spill over into carnal desire. Even innocent interactions between unmarried men and women were viewed with suspicion. The church's teachings on female sexuality were particularly harsh and contradictory. Women were simultaneously revered as potential vessels of divine grace, like the Virgin Mary, and reviled as dangerous temptresses who could lead men to damnation, like Eve. This impossible standard meant that women could never fully escape suspicion and condemnation, regardless of their behavior. Marriage itself was presented as a spiritual compromise for those too weak to achieve the higher calling of celibacy. Priests regularly preached that truly holy individuals should renounce marriage entirely and dedicate themselves to religious life. This created a culture where romantic love and marriage were seen as spiritually inferior choices that marked the participants as lacking in divine grace. The church's control over romantic relationships extended into the economic sphere as well. Marriages required ecclesiastical approval, which often came with substantial fees that poor families could barely afford. The church also controlled inheritance laws, ensuring that property and wealth remained under religious influence across generations. Even the language of love was constrained by religious orthodoxy. Secular love poetry was condemned as spiritually dangerous, while approved forms of romantic expression had to be couched in religious metaphors and imagery. Lovers were encouraged to see their earthly relationships as pale reflections of their relationship with God, never as valuable or meaningful in their own right. The psychological impact of this religious control was devastating. Young people learned to distrust their own emotions and desires, viewing natural romantic feelings as evidence of spiritual corruption. This internalized shame created generations of individuals who were unable to form healthy emotional bonds or experience genuine intimacy without overwhelming guilt and fear. The enforcement of religious orthodoxy in romantic relationships was not merely about controlling individual behavior, but about maintaining broader social order. The church understood that if people could choose their own partners based on love and attraction, it would undermine the entire system of arranged marriages that kept wealth and power concentrated within established families. Religious authorities also used romantic relationships as a means of identifying and persecuting heretics and dissidents. Couples who challenged conventional marriage arrangements or expressed unorthodox views about sexuality were often accused of harboring dangerous religious ideas. Love became a form of political rebellion that had to be carefully monitored and controlled. The church's stranglehold on romantic life extended even beyond death. Couples who had defied religious teachings in life might be denied proper burial or have their souls condemned to purgatory. Families lived in terror that their loved ones' romantic choices might doom them to eternal suffering. This system of religious control created a society where love was literally dangerous, where the most natural human emotions were treated as spiritual diseases that required constant treatment and surveillance. Young people grew up learning to fear their own hearts, to distrust their deepest feelings, and to accept loveless relationships as the price of salvation. As we continue to explore the nightmare of medieval romance, we see how the church's totalitarian control over intimate relationships created a world where genuine love was not just difficult, but actively persecuted. The next phase of our journey will reveal how these religious restrictions combined with social and economic pressures to create a perfect storm of romantic oppression that made meaningful relationships virtually impossible for all but the most fortunate or rebellious souls. But even these social and physical dangers paled in comparison to the most powerful force controlling medieval romance, the Church itself. For in this age of faith, the Catholic Church didn't merely influence romantic relationships, it owned them completely. Every whisper of affection, every stolen glance, every beating heart was subject to the Church's vast network of rules, regulations, and punishments that made modern dating apps seem like a paradise of freedom. The medieval Church had developed what can only be described as an obsession with controlling human sexuality that bordered on the pathological. They had created a system so intricate, so all-encompassing, that it regulated not just who you could marry and when, but how often you could be intimate with your own spouse, what positions were acceptable, and even what thoughts you were allowed to have about the person lying next to you in bed. Picture, if you will, a young peasant couple, perhaps named William and Agnes, who had somehow managed to catch each other's eye during Sunday Mass. In our modern world, they might exchange phone numbers, meet for coffee, perhaps go to a movie. But in medieval times, even the most innocent romantic interest was immediately subject to ecclesiastical scrutiny that would make a government surveillance program seem quaint by comparison. First, there was the question of when they could even speak to each other. The Church had designated certain seasons as completely off-limits for romantic activity. During Lent, Advent, and the various feast days scattered throughout the year, any expression of romantic or sexual desire was considered a grave sin. When you calculated all the prohibited times, a medieval couple was only supposed to engage in courtship activities for roughly a third of the year. But even during the permitted seasons, the Church's rules were suffocating. Young people were forbidden from meeting alone, required to have chaperones present at all times, and expected to conduct their conversations in full view of their families and neighbours. Privacy, that basic requirement for romantic connection, was seen as an invitation to sin and was therefore strictly forbidden. The Church taught that romantic love itself was spiritually dangerous, a distraction from the proper worship of God that could lead souls directly to damnation. Priests preached that passionate feelings between men and women were evidence of humanity's fallen nature, remnants of original sin that needed to be suppressed rather than celebrated. Even within marriage, couples were warned that enjoying each other's company too much could be a form of idolatry. This created an impossible psychological burden for young people experiencing the natural stirrings of romantic attraction. They were taught to view their own emotions as evidence of moral corruption, to distrust their feelings, and to seek forgiveness for desires that we now understand to be completely normal and healthy. Imagine the torment of a young woman like Agnes, lying awake at night, praying for God to cleanse her heart of what she'd been told were sinful thoughts about the boy she'd smiled at after church. The Church's control extended deep into the most intimate aspects of married life as well. Couples were provided with detailed instructions about when they could be intimate with each other, and these rules were so restrictive that they would make a monastic timetable seem flexible. Sundays were forbidden, as were Wednesdays and Fridays. The entire seasons of Lent and Advent were off-limits. Any feast day was prohibited. During a woman's menstrual cycle, intimacy was forbidden. While she was pregnant or nursing, it was forbidden. When you added up all these restrictions, medieval couples were only supposed to be intimate for perhaps 40 days out of the entire year. But the Church didn't stop at regulating frequency. They also dictated exactly how married couples should conduct themselves during those brief permitted moments. Certain positions were forbidden as unnatural. Pleasure was discouraged, even within marriage, as it suggested that the couple was motivated by lust rather than the proper desire to procreate. Women who seemed to enjoy marital intimacy too much were suspected of being controlled by demonic influences. The Church had developed an elaborate theology that viewed sexual desire, even between married couples, as inherently corrupting. They taught that the only acceptable reason for intimate relations was procreation, and that any pleasure derived from the act was evidence of spiritual weakness. This created a culture where couples were expected to approach each other with guilt and reluctance rather than joy and affection. Church courts, staffed by celibate priests who had theoretically never experienced romantic love themselves, made binding decisions about the most intimate aspects of people's lives. These ecclesiastical tribunals could annul marriages, force separations, and punish couples for violations of sexual conduct that might include anything from kissing too passionately to expressing too much affection in public. The system of confession further invaded the privacy of romantic relationships. Couples were required to regularly report to their priests about their intimate lives, describing in detail their thoughts, desires, and actions. Priests would probe deeply into the most personal aspects of marriages, asking invasive questions about frequency, methods, and motivations. This information could then be used against couples if they fell out of favor with church authorities. Women bore the brunt of this ecclesiastical control in particularly cruel ways. They were simultaneously idealized as vessels of purity and demonized as sources of temptation. The church taught that women were naturally more susceptible to sin and more likely to lead men astray through their beauty and sexuality. Any woman who seemed too confident, too attractive, or too independent risked being labeled as a threat to the spiritual well-being of the community. The cult of the Virgin Mary, while ostensibly honoring feminine virtue, actually created impossible standards for real women. They were expected to be simultaneously pure and maternal, submissive and strong, beautiful but not seductive. The slightest deviation from these contradictory expectations could result in social ostracism or worse. Perhaps most tragically, the Church's teaching about sexuality created deep shame and fear around the very emotions that should have brought couples together. Instead of viewing love as a gift from God or a reflection of divine grace, medieval Christianity treated romantic passion as evidence of humanity's corrupted nature. Couples learned to hide their affection, suppress their desires, and approach each other with suspicion rather than trust. The impact of these teachings extended far beyond individual relationships to poison entire communities. Neighbors were encouraged to spy on each other and report suspected violations of sexual morality. Children grew up learning that their own parents' love for each other was somehow spiritually suspect. The bonds that should have held society together were weakened by constant surveillance and judgment. This ecclesiastical reign of terror over romantic relationships created a culture where love itself became a form of rebellion. The greatest act of defiance a medieval couple could commit was to genuinely care for each other, to find joy in each other's company, to approach intimacy with pleasure rather than duty. In a world where the Church controlled every aspect of daily life, love became the last refuge of human freedom, carefully hidden from prying eyes and judgmental priests. As we drift deeper into sleep, let us be grateful that we live in an age where love is celebrated rather than suppressed, where couples can find joy in each other without fear of ecclesiastical punishment, and where the most intimate aspects of human relationships are protected from the intrusive gaze of religious authorities. The medieval Church's war on love serves as a sobering reminder of how institutions can corrupt even the most beautiful aspects of human experience when they prioritize control over compassion. Sweet dreams, and may your own heart be free to love without fear of judgment or persecution. As the sun dipped below the horizon and church bells echoed across medieval Europe, young lovers faced their most treacherous hours. For it was in the twilight spaces between day and night, in the shadowed corners where candlelight flickered against stone walls, that romance became most dangerous, not just from the prying eyes of family or clergy, but from the very real threat that love itself might be evidence of something far more sinister. Medieval society existed in a state of perpetual supernatural anxiety. Every unexplained emotion, every sudden attraction, every passionate outburst could be interpreted as evidence of demonic interference or witchcraft. Love, with its power to transform rational people into irrational creatures, was particularly suspect. When a sensible merchant's daughter suddenly began writing poetry, when a steadfast farmer abandoned his fields to follow a travelling minstrel, when a devoted wife started meeting strangers at crossroads under the full moon, the community didn't see romance, they saw possession. The church taught that excessive passion was a gateway for evil spirits. Priests warned from their pulpits that Satan used romantic desire as his primary weapon against Christian souls. Young people were instructed to examine their hearts constantly, to confess any stirrings of attraction before they could take root and grow into something monstrous. The very intensity that made love beautiful became, in medieval minds, proof of its supernatural corruption. Consider the plight of Agnes, a baker's daughter in 14th century France. When she began showing interest in the local blacksmith's apprentice, her behavior was carefully scrutinized by neighbors and family alike. Did she laugh too loudly at his jokes? Did her eyes linger too long on his face? Did she find excuses to walk past the smithy more often than her daily errands required? Each of these actions, innocent by our standards, could be interpreted as evidence that Agnes had fallen under an enchantment. The fear wasn't entirely irrational within the medieval worldview. Folk magic and love spells were indeed practiced throughout Europe. Cunning women, herb sellers, and village healers did provide potions and charms designed to kindle or extinguish romantic feelings. But the line between natural attraction and supernatural manipulation was impossibly thin, and the consequences of crossing it were severe. Agnes's story took a darker turn when her interest in the blacksmith's apprentice was not returned. In her disappointment, she sought advice from an old woman who lived at the edge of the village, someone known for her knowledge of herbs and her ability to cure livestock ailments. The woman gave Agnes a simple charm, a small bag of herbs to carry that would supposedly make her more appealing to the object of her affections. Within days, the blacksmith's apprentice began showing interest in Agnes. He started seeking her out, complimenting her appearance, even asking her father's permission to walk with her after church. To modern eyes, this might simply be the natural progression of a shy courtship finally encouraged by a boost in Agnes's confidence. But, to medieval observers, the sudden change in the young man's behavior was deeply suspicious. Whispers began to circulate through the village. Agnes had been seen visiting the herb woman. The timing of the apprentice's change of heart was too convenient to be natural. Soon, accusations of love magic were being made openly. Agnes found herself facing not just social ostracism, but formal charges of witchcraft. The trial that followed reveals the impossible situation facing women in medieval society. Agnes was accused of using supernatural means to manipulate the blacksmith's apprentice into loving her. The evidence against her consisted primarily of testimony about her changed behavior, her visit to the herb woman, and the timing of the apprentice's romantic interest. There was no physical proof of magical practices, no testimony from the herb woman who had mysteriously disappeared, and no confession of supernatural activity. But in medieval legal systems dealing with witchcraft accusations, the burden of proof was often reversed. Agnes was required to prove her innocence rather than having her accusers prove her guilt. How does one prove that love is natural rather than magical? How does one demonstrate that attraction is genuine rather than enchanted? The very questions were impossible to answer satisfactorily. Under interrogation, which likely involved some form of torture designed to extract confessions, Agnes eventually admitted to visiting the herb woman and receiving a charm. This confession, extracted under duress, was taken as proof of her guilt. She was condemned as a practitioner of love magic and sentenced to public humiliation, banishment from the village, and forfeiture of any property she might have inherited. The blacksmith's apprentice, meanwhile, was treated as a victim of supernatural manipulation. He was absolved of any responsibility for his romantic choices and encouraged to avoid Agnes completely to prevent further enchantment. The message was clear. When men made romantic decisions that seemed irrational or inappropriate, it was often easier to blame female witchcraft than to acknowledge masculine agency or poor judgment. Agnes's fate was not unusual. Throughout medieval Europe, women found themselves accused of love magic for the crime of being romantically successful, emotionally expressive, or simply unfortunate enough to inspire passion in men who later regretted their choices. The accusations served multiple social functions, providing explanations for uncomfortable romantic situations, while reinforcing male authority and female subordination. The fear of love magic also created a thriving economy of protective measures and counterspells. Families would spend considerable resources on blessed amulets, holy water, and special prayers designed to protect their children from romantic enchantment. Churches offered special masses for those who believed themselves bewitched by love. Even wealthy merchants and nobles employed spiritual advisors to guard against supernatural romantic manipulation. These protective measures created their own dangers. The practitioners who provided counter-magic were often the same individuals who might be accused of practicing love magic in the first place. The wise women, herb sellers, and folk healers who helped people protect themselves from romantic enchantment were also the most likely suspects when accusations of witchcraft arose. It was a cruel irony that those who sought to help often found themselves targeted for persecution. The psychological impact of living under such supernatural terror cannot be overstated. Young people learn to distrust their own emotions, to view romantic attraction as potentially dangerous, and to constantly examine their feelings for signs of supernatural corruption. The natural development of romantic relationships was poisoned by fear and suspicion. Parents watched their children's behavior obsessively, looking for signs that they might have fallen under malevolent influence. A daughter who suddenly became interested in her appearance, a son who started writing poetry, a child who seemed happier than usual, all could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural interference. The joy and excitement that should accompany young love became instead sources of anxiety and dread. The documentation from medieval witch trials reveals the devastating human cost of these supernatural beliefs. Women were burned at the stake for the crime of being too attractive, too charming, or too successful in matters of the heart. Men found themselves accused of using supernatural means to seduce women above their social station. Entire communities were torn apart by accusations and counter-accusations of romantic witchcraft. Even those who escaped formal prosecution often found their lives destroyed by suspicion and rumour. A woman accused of love magic might find herself unable to marry, unable to work, unable to participate in community life. The accusation alone was often enough to ruin someone's reputation permanently. The medieval obsession with love magic also reveals deeper anxieties about female sexuality and romantic agency. In a society where women's romantic choices were supposed to be controlled by fathers and husbands, any display of sexual or romantic independence was threatening. Accusations of witchcraft provided a mechanism for controlling and punishing women who stepped outside prescribed gender roles. The belief that women could use supernatural means to manipulate men's affections also served to explain and excuse male romantic behavior that might otherwise be seen as irresponsible or immoral. A married man who abandoned his family for another woman could claim he had been bewitched. A nobleman who broke his engagement could argue that he had been under supernatural influence. These explanations allowed men to avoid responsibility for their romantic choices, while simultaneously providing society with scapegoats for the disruptions that passionate love inevitably caused. The intersection of supernatural beliefs with medieval romance created a perfect storm of fear, suspicion, and persecution that made genuine love nearly impossible to achieve or sustain. Young people were taught to fear their own hearts, to distrust their emotions, and to view romantic passion as evidence of spiritual corruption. The simple human need for connection and affection became a dangerous journey through supernatural terrors and social condemnation. As we continue our exploration of medieval dating nightmares, we see how these supernatural fears, combined with social restrictions, economic pressures, and religious oppression, to create a system that was hostile to love in all its forms. The medieval world may have produced some of history's greatest romantic literature, but for ordinary people trying to find love and happiness, it was a landscape of unimaginable dangers where even the most innocent romantic gesture could lead to accusations of witchcraft, social ostracism, or death. The legacy of these medieval supernatural terrors extended far beyond the Middle Ages, shaping Western attitudes toward female sexuality, romantic agency, and the nature of love itself for centuries to come. Understanding this dark history helps us appreciate not only how far we've come in accepting romantic love as natural and beautiful, but also how deeply embedded these fears became in our cultural consciousness, echoing even today in anxieties about desire, attraction, and the power dynamics of romantic relationships. But if you thought the physical dangers and social restrictions we've explored were the worst aspects of medieval romance, prepare yourself for something far more sinister. Because lurking beneath every stolen kiss, every whispered endearment, every flutter of romantic hope, was a web of supernatural terror that could transform the simple act of falling in love into a literal death sentence. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval cottage, a young woman named Isabel carefully braided herbs into her hair, whispering ancient words her grandmother had taught her. She wasn't casting spells or communing with dark forces. She was simply trying to attract the attention of Thomas, the blacksmith's son, using folk remedies that had been passed down through generations of village women. But in an age where the line between medicine and magic was razor thin, such innocent actions could easily be misconstrued as witchcraft. The medieval world was absolutely saturated with supernatural beliefs that directly impacted romantic relationships. Love itself was often viewed through a lens of suspicion and fear. If someone fell suddenly and passionately in love, it might be attributed to love potions, enchantments, or demonic influence rather than natural attraction. Women in particular were seen as susceptible to supernatural manipulation. Any woman who displayed unusual beauty, intelligence, or independence risked being branded as a witch or sorceress. The Church's teachings on sexuality created an atmosphere of terror around physical desire. Lust was considered one of the 7 deadly sins, and any intense romantic or sexual feeling could be interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or corruption. This meant that the very emotions that draw people together were treated as dangerous spiritual threats. Young people were taught to be deeply suspicious of their own feelings, creating a psychological minefield around the development of romantic relationships. Consider the plight of a young man named Edmund, who lived in 14th century England. When he found himself powerfully attracted to a local merchant's daughter, he didn't celebrate these feelings or see them as natural human emotions. Instead, he was tormented by the possibility that his desires were sinful, that he was being tempted by Satan, or that the woman herself might be using supernatural means to ensnare him. This kind of psychological torture was commonplace, turning what should have been joyous romantic awakening into a source of guilt, fear, and spiritual crisis. The belief in love magic was both widespread and dangerous. It was commonly accepted that certain individuals, particularly older women with knowledge of herbs and folk remedies, could create potions and spells to influence romantic feelings. While some of these beliefs led to harmless folk practices, they also created a climate where women could be accused of witchcraft for the most innocent actions. A woman who was skilled in herbalism, who lived alone, or who was simply disliked by her neighbors could find herself facing accusations of using supernatural powers to manipulate men's affections. The witch trials that plagued Europe from the 15th through 17th centuries had a devastating impact on romantic relationships. Women lived in constant fear that their actions, words, or even their appearance might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural powers. This created an atmosphere of suspicion and terror that poisoned relationships between men and women. Men were taught to be wary of women who were too beautiful, too intelligent, or too independent, as these qualities might indicate supernatural influence. The legal system provided no protection for those accused of love magic or witchcraft. The burden of proof was often reversed, requiring the accused to prove their innocence, rather than requiring accusers to prove guilt. Confessions were extracted through torture, and the methods used to identify witches were based on superstition rather than evidence. A woman might be condemned to death simply because a man claimed she had bewitched him into loving her, or because someone in the community believed she had used magic to steal another woman's husband. The story of Agnes Waterhouse, one of the first women executed for witchcraft in England in 1566, illustrates how romantic relationships could become entangled with accusations of supernatural crime. Agnes was an elderly widow who lived alone and was known for her knowledge of herbal remedies. When several young men in her village experienced unrequited love or romantic disappointments, rumours began to spread that Agnes was using magic to interfere with their romantic lives. The accusations escalated until she was arrested, tried, and executed for witchcraft, despite the complete lack of credible evidence against her. The fear of supernatural influence extended to every aspect of courtship and marriage. Wedding ceremonies included numerous rituals and protections designed to ward off evil spirits and malicious magic. Brides wore specific colours, carried particular herbs, or performed certain actions to protect themselves from supernatural interference. The wedding night itself was surrounded by superstitions and protective rituals, as it was believed to be a particularly vulnerable time when evil forces might try to curse the union or prevent consummation. Even the simple act of gift-giving between lovers was fraught with supernatural implications. A ring, a lock of hair, or a pressed flower could be interpreted as a magical charm or a component in a love spell. Young people had to be extremely careful about what they gave to or received from romantic interests, as innocent tokens of affection could later be used as evidence of witchcraft if the relationship went sour or if someone wanted to make accusations. The belief in the evil eye added another layer of danger to romantic relationships. It was widely believed that certain individuals could curse others simply by looking at them with malicious intent. This meant that jealous rivals, disappointed suitors, or disapproving family members could be blamed for romantic misfortunes through supernatural means. If a couple experienced problems in their relationship, if a pregnancy ended in miscarriage, or if one partner fell ill, it might be attributed to the evil eye rather than natural causes. The concept of demonic possession also impacted romantic relationships in terrifying ways. Young women who displayed unusual behaviour, particularly if it involved rejecting arranged marriages or expressing strong romantic preferences, might be accused of being possessed by demons. The treatments for such possession were brutal and often fatal, involving exorcisms, beatings, starvation, and other forms of torture designed to drive out the supposed evil spirits. Religious authorities actively promoted these supernatural fears as a way of controlling romantic and sexual behavior. By teaching people to be suspicious of their own emotions and to fear supernatural influence in their relationships, the Church maintained strict control over courtship and marriage practices. Young people were discouraged from following their hearts or making independent romantic choices, as such actions might be evidence of supernatural manipulation. The intersection of medicine and magic created additional dangers for those seeking help with romantic problems. Herbalists, midwives, and folk healers who provided remedies for lovesickness, infertility, or other romantic difficulties were particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Even physicians and learned men could find themselves accused of using supernatural means if their treatments were too successful, or if they were associated with romantic scandals. The psychological impact of living under such superstitious terror cannot be overstated. Young people grew up believing that their most natural and fundamental emotions were potentially dangerous, that expressions of love might be evidence of supernatural corruption, and that romantic relationships were constantly threatened by invisible malevolent forces. This created a culture of fear and suspicion that made genuine intimacy and trust nearly impossible to achieve. The documentation from medieval and early modern court records reveals the devastating human cost of these supernatural beliefs. Countless women were tortured and executed on charges related to love magic or romantic witchcraft. Families were torn apart by accusations and suspicions. Communities were divided by fear and paranoia. The very bonds that should have brought people together became sources of danger and terror. The irony is that many of the practices condemned as supernatural were actually based on genuine knowledge of herbs, psychology, and human behavior. Women who understood how to use certain plants to improve health, who could read people's emotions and provide good advice, or who simply had the confidence to live independently, were often the ones accused of witchcraft. The systematic persecution of such women represented not just an attack on individuals, but a broader assault on female knowledge and autonomy. The belief in supernatural influence also served as a convenient excuse for men who wanted to escape responsibility for their romantic choices. A man who abandoned his wife for another woman could claim he had been bewitched. A nobleman who broke an engagement could argue that he had been under supernatural influence. These accusations allowed men to avoid the social and legal consequences of their actions, while simultaneously destroying the lives of the women they blamed. The fear of love magic extended even to the highest levels of society. Royal marriages were surrounded by elaborate protective rituals, and court physicians were constantly on guard against supernatural threats to royal romantic relationships. Kings and queens employed specialists in counter-magic to protect against romantic curses, and political enemies might be accused of using supernatural means to interfere with royal marriages or fertility. The artistic and literary culture of the medieval period both reflected and reinforced these supernatural fears. Stories of enchantresses, love potions, and magical seduction were extremely popular, but they also served to reinforce the idea that romantic relationships were inherently dangerous and potentially supernatural in nature. Young people absorbed these cultural messages, learning to view their own romantic experiences through a lens of suspicion and fear. The legal codes of medieval Europe reveal how thoroughly supernatural beliefs had penetrated the justice system. Laws against love magic were detailed and severe, with punishments ranging from fines and public humiliation to torture and execution. The fact that such laws existed and were regularly enforced demonstrates how seriously these supernatural threats were taken by medieval authorities. The economic impact of supernatural fears around romance was also significant. Families might spend considerable resources on protective charms, counterspells, and other supernatural defenses for their children's romantic relationships. The fear of magical interference could disrupt trade relationships, political alliances, and social connections, as people became suspicious of anyone who might have supernatural motivations for their romantic advice or interference. The geographic spread of these beliefs was remarkable, extending across all of Europe and beyond. While specific practices and beliefs varied from region to region, the underlying fear of supernatural influence in romantic relationships was virtually universal. This suggests that these beliefs served important social and psychological functions, even as they caused tremendous suffering and injustice. As we reflect on this dark chapter in the history of human relationships, we see how the combination of ignorance, fear, and social control created a perfect storm of terror around the most basic human emotions. The medieval period's supernatural beliefs about love and romance represent perhaps the most extreme example in human history of how society can turn the natural desire for connection and intimacy into a source of mortal danger. The legacy of these beliefs extended far beyond the medieval period, influencing attitudes toward women, sexuality, and romantic relationships for centuries to come. The witch trials of the early modern period, the persecution of women healers and midwives, and the broader cultural suspicion of female independence all had their roots in the medieval period's supernatural fears around romance and sexuality. In examining this aspect of medieval romantic life, we gain insight not just into the past, but into the ongoing human tendency to fear and demonize what we don't understand. The medieval period's supernatural beliefs about love remind us of how dangerous it can be when ignorance and fear are allowed to override reason and compassion, and how the most beautiful aspects of human experience can be twisted into sources of terror and persecution. The young woman Isabel, with whom we began this exploration, might have lived her entire life in fear that her innocent attempts to attract love would be misinterpreted as witchcraft. In a world where even the most natural human desires were viewed with supernatural suspicion, the simple act of falling in love became not just a personal risk, but a potential death sentence. This represents perhaps the cruelest irony of medieval romantic life, that the very emotions that make us most human were treated as evidence of inhuman corruption. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval romance wasn't the physical dangers or social constraints we've explored. It was how hope itself became a weapon used against the human heart. Because in this world, where love was systematically crushed, where passion was demonized, and where choice was an illusion, the cruelest trick was that people were still capable of dreaming. And those dreams, those flickering moments of possibility, were often what destroyed them most completely. Consider the tragic case of Eleanor, a young woman in 12th century France whose story survives in the fragments of court records and church documents. Eleanor was the daughter of a minor lord, promised in marriage to a brutal older man known for beating his previous wives to death. But Eleanor had heard the songs of the troubadours. She had listened to tales of courtly love, of knights who died for their ladies, of passion that transcended earthly bonds. When a young knight named Gautier arrived at her father's castle, Eleanor believed her prayers had been answered. He was handsome, gentle, and seemed to return her shy glances across the great hall. They began to exchange secret messages, stolen conversations in shadowed alcoves. For a few precious weeks, Eleanor allowed herself to hope. Perhaps she could escape her arranged marriage. Perhaps love really could conquer all. But hope in medieval times was a luxury that demanded payment in blood. When Eleanor's father discovered their romance, he didn't simply punish his daughter. He accused Gautier of attempted rape, a charge that carried the death penalty. Gautier was tortured until he confessed to crimes he hadn't committed, then executed in the courtyard while Aliénor was forced to watch from her tower window. The message was clear. This was what happened to women who dared to hope for love. Aliénor was married off the following week to her original betrothed. She died 6 months later, officially from a fever, though the servants whispered of bruises that suggested otherwise. Her crime hadn't been loving Gautier. Her crime had been believing that love was possible. This weaponization of hope was perhaps the most sophisticated cruelty of the medieval romantic system. The Church preached about divine love while making human love a sin. The troubadours sang of impossible passion, while the reality of marriage remained brutal and loveless. Society dangled the promise of romantic fulfillment just close enough to inspire longing, then snatched it away with devastating consequences. Young people were surrounded by stories of love, by songs and poems that described the very emotions they felt burning in their own hearts. But these weren't meant to inspire them to seek love. They were meant to teach them that love was suffering, that desire led to damnation, that the highest form of romance was one that could never be consummated. The literary tradition of courtly love that emerged in medieval France was particularly insidious in this regard. These stories celebrated knights who pined away for married ladies, who performed impossible feats of devotion while never actually touching their beloved. The message was that true love was pure precisely because it was unfulfilled. Physical consummation, emotional satisfaction, mutual happiness. These were seen as corruptions of the ideal. This created a psychological torture chamber for real people experiencing real emotions. A young man falling in love was taught that his desires were base and corrupting. A young woman experiencing attraction was told that she was following in Eve's footsteps toward damnation. The very feelings that made them human were reframed as evidence of their spiritual failure. The economic structures of medieval society made this emotional manipulation even more devastating. Hope wasn't just dangerous because it was sinful. It was dangerous because it made people question the arrangements that kept society functioning. A peasant girl who dreamed of marrying for love might refuse the practical match her parents had arranged with a farmer who could provide for her family. A nobleman's son who fell in love with a merchant's daughter might threaten carefully negotiated political alliances. Hope, in other words, was economically disruptive. And in a world where survival was always precarious, where a bad harvest could mean starvation and a broken alliance could mean war, the luxury of romantic dreams was seen as a threat to the very fabric of civilization. The Church actively participated in this suppression of hope through its teachings about marriage and sexuality. Couples were told that marriage was a sacrament, blessed by God, but they were also taught that sexual desire within marriage was sinful. They were expected to procreate, but not to enjoy it. They were supposed to love their spouses, but not too much. The contradictions were impossible to navigate, creating a constant state of guilt and confusion that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. Even the marriage ceremony itself was designed to crush hope rather than celebrate it. The bride often met her husband for the first time at the altar. She was transferred from her father's ownership to her husband's like property-changing hands. The vows she spoke were about obedience and submission, not love and partnership. Whatever dreams she might have harbored about romantic love were systematically dismantled in front of witnesses who nodded approvingly at her surrender. The wedding night that followed was often the final destruction of any remaining hope. With no understanding of female sexuality, no concept of consent as we understand it today, and no expectation that women should enjoy physical intimacy, the consummation of marriage was frequently traumatic. Young brides were expected to submit silently to whatever their husbands demanded, to produce children regardless of their own readiness or desire. For many women, this first sexual experience was so painful and degrading that it coloured their entire understanding of physical love. Hope died not in a moment of dramatic tragedy, but in a slow, grinding realization that the reality of marriage bore no resemblance to the romantic ideals they had been taught to yearn for. The isolation of medieval life made this emotional devastation even more complete. Once married, a woman typically moved to her husband's household, often far from her family and childhood friends. She was surrounded by strangers who owed their loyalty to her husband, not to her. If her marriage was unhappy, if her husband was cruel, if her dreams had been crushed, she had no one to confide in, no support system to help her cope. This isolation was deliberately maintained by the social structures of the time. Women who formed close friendships with other women were viewed with suspicion. They might share dangerous ideas about independence or happiness. They might support each other in ways that threatened male authority. Better to keep them separated, each woman trapped in her own private misery, believing that her suffering was unique and inevitable. The few women who did manage to maintain connections with others often found these relationships turned against them. A friendship could be reinterpreted as evidence of witchcraft. A confidence shared could become testimony in an accusation of adultery. Even the bonds between women, those last refugees of emotional support, were poisoned by the constant threat of betrayal and suspicion. Religious life, which might have offered an alternative to the brutality of secular marriage, carried its own forms of hope-crushing despair. Women who entered convents often did so, believing they were choosing a life of spiritual fulfillment and divine love. What they found instead was another form of patriarchal control, where male priests and bishops dictated every aspect of their existence. The mystical traditions that flourished in medieval convents, where women described passionate spiritual relationships with Christ, were carefully monitored and controlled by male religious authorities. A nun's ecstatic visions might be celebrated as holy, or they might be condemned as demonic possession. The difference often depended not on the content of her experiences, but on whether they threatened the authority of the men who ruled over her. Even in death, hope was denied to medieval women. The promise of heaven was real, but it came with conditions that seemed designed to ensure that most women would fall short. A woman who had enjoyed sexual pleasure, even within marriage, might be condemned for lust. A woman who had shown too much attachment to her children might be guilty of loving earthly things more than God. A woman who had defended herself against an abusive husband might be damned for disobedience. The result was a society where women lived in constant fear, not just of earthly punishment, but of eternal damnation. Every natural emotion, every human desire, every moment of joy or pleasure carried the potential for spiritual catastrophe. Hope itself became a kind of sin, evidence of pride or ingratitude for the suffering that God had ordained. As we reach deeper into this exploration of medieval romance, we see how systematically hope was used as a tool of control. People were encouraged to dream just enough to make their reality seem inadequate, but never enough to actually change their circumstances. They were taught to long for love while being told that love was dangerous. They were shown glimpses of happiness while being assured that happiness was selfish. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't simply the result of harsh living conditions or primitive understanding of human psychology. This was a deliberate system designed to maintain power structures that benefited a small elite at the expense of everyone else. Hope was dangerous because it made people question why their lives had to be so miserable. Dreams were threatening because they suggested that things could be different. And so, medieval society developed increasingly sophisticated methods for crushing hope while appearing to celebrate it. They created elaborate romantic mythologies that made suffering seem noble. They established religious doctrines that made earthly happiness seem spiritually suspect. They built social structures that made genuine love practically impossible while maintaining that love was the highest human aspiration. The true nightmare of medieval dating wasn't just that it was dangerous, though it certainly was. It wasn't just that it was controlled by others, though that was undeniably true. The real horror was that the system was designed to make people complicit in their own misery, to make them believe that their suffering was noble, that their unfulfilled desires were evidence of spiritual purity, that their broken hearts were somehow more beautiful than whole ones. This psychological manipulation was perhaps the most effective form of control ever devised. It didn't require constant surveillance or brutal enforcement. It worked by convincing people that their oppression was actually freedom, that their pain was actually love, that their despair was actually hope. But if you thought the supernatural terrors surrounding medieval romance were the worst of it, you haven't yet heard about the economic realities that made love not just dangerous, but literally impossible for most people. Because in medieval society, romance wasn't just spiritually forbidden or socially constrained. It was economically ruinous. The simple act of falling in love could bankrupt families, destroy communities, and condemn entire bloodlines to poverty and starvation. Let's start with something we take completely for granted today. The idea that you might choose your romantic partner based on personal attraction or emotional compatibility. In medieval times, this concept wasn't just foreign, it was economically suicidal. Marriage was the single most important financial transaction most families would ever make, a carefully calculated business deal that could determine whether your children ate or starved, whether your land remained productive, or whether your family name survived another generation. For peasants, who made up roughly 90% of the population, romantic love was quite literally a luxury they could not afford. A peasant family's survival depended on combining resources, pooling labor, and maintaining the delicate agricultural partnerships that kept them from starvation. When a peasant father arranged his daughter's marriage, he wasn't thinking about her happiness. He was calculating whether the union would provide enough oxen for ploughing, enough hands for harvest, enough land to feed the children who would inevitably follow. Consider the case of a typical peasant family in 14th century France. The father, Henri, works a small plot of land barely large enough to feed his wife and 3 children. His 14-year-old daughter Marie has caught the eye of a young man from a neighboring village, someone she actually finds attractive and kind. But Henri knows that if Marie marries for love, his family will lose access to the 2 oxen owned by Thomas, the older widower from their own village who has also expressed interest in Marie. Without those oxen, Henri cannot plough his fields properly. Without proper ploughing, the harvest fails. Without harvest, his remaining children starve. Marie's romantic preferences, however genuine and touching, are irrelevant when weighed against basic survival. She will marry Thomas, bear his children, and learn to find what happiness she can in a union built on economic necessity rather than emotional connection. This wasn't cruelty, it was mathematics. Harsh, unforgiving mathematics, where love was a variable that simply couldn't be included in the equation. But the economic constraints went far beyond simple resource pooling. Medieval society operated on a complex web of obligations, debts, and feudal relationships that made unauthorized romantic attachments potentially catastrophic. A peasant who married without his lord's permission could face fines, loss of land, or even exile. A merchant's daughter who eloped with a man from a rival family might trigger trade wars that destroyed entire commercial networks. The dowry system added another layer of economic brutality to medieval romance. Families were expected to provide substantial payments, land, livestock, gold, household goods, when their daughters married. For many families, these dowries represented years of savings, often requiring them to go into debt or sell vital assets. The pressure to marry daughters off to the highest bidder wasn't just about social climbing. It was about economic survival. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. The dowry system meant that having daughters was often seen as an economic disaster. Female children represented years of expense followed by a massive financial outlay that benefited another family. Some families, faced with the impossible mathematics of medieval economics, simply couldn't afford to let their daughters marry at all. These women became permanent dependents, economic burdens who consumed resources without contributing to the family's reproductive or economic success. For the nobility, the economic calculations were even more complex and ruthless. Noble marriages weren't just about combining two families, they were about territorial control, military alliances, and political power that could affect thousands of people. A nobleman who married for love rather than strategic advantage might find his lands invaded, his allies abandoning him, and his subjects suffering under enemy occupation. The story of Edward II of England and his controversial relationships illustrates how romantic choices at the highest levels could have devastating economic consequences. Edward's favouritism toward Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser created such political instability that trade networks collapsed, tax collection failed, and the kingdom teetered on the edge of financial ruin. Edward's personal romantic choices, whether with his male favourites or his neglected Queen Isabella, had economic ripple effects that impacted every level of society. The guild system added yet another economic barrier to romantic freedom. Craftsmen, merchants, and artisans operated within strict professional organizations that controlled everything from production quotas to marriage partners. A baker who wanted to marry outside his guild might lose his right to practice his trade. A weaver's daughter who fell in love with a blacksmith's son could find both families expelled from their respective guilds, losing not just their livelihoods, but their entire social identity. Even the church, supposedly the guardian of spiritual values, operated according to ruthless economic logic when it came to marriage. The complex system of fees, dispensations, and ecclesiastical permissions turned every romantic relationship into a financial transaction. Want to marry your second cousin? That'll cost you. Need to divorce an abusive spouse? Better have connections and gold. Seeking an annulment because your arranged marriage is unbearable. Hope you can afford to outbid your spouse's family. The economic mathematics of medieval romance become even more crushing when we consider the role of inheritance laws. In most of medieval Europe, property passed through male lines, meaning that women had little economic independence and few options outside of marriage. A woman who chose love over financial security wasn't just risking her own future, she was condemning herself to a life of dependency and potential destitution. But perhaps most tragically, the economic constraints surrounding medieval romance created a vicious cycle that perpetuated itself across generations. Children born into loveless marriages arranged for economic convenience learned early that personal desires were subordinate to financial necessities. They internalized the lesson that romantic love was selfish, impractical, and dangerous. When their time came to arrange marriages for their own children, they perpetuated the same system that had denied them emotional fulfillment. The psychological toll of this economic brutality cannot be overstated. Medieval literature is filled with stories of people driven to madness, suicide, or violence by the impossible choice between love and survival. The courtly love tradition that celebrated impossible, unconsummated passion wasn't just literary fancy. It was a reflection of a society where genuine romantic fulfillment was economically impossible for most people. Trade networks themselves became weapons in the war against romantic freedom. Merchant families would threaten to cut off business relationships with anyone who allowed their children to marry for love, rather than commercial advantage. Cities would embargo communities that harbored runaway lovers. The entire economic infrastructure of medieval society was designed to punish romantic autonomy and reward emotional submission. Even the seasonal rhythms of agricultural life worked against romantic development. The brief periods when young people might have opportunities to meet and get to know each other, during harvest festivals or religious celebrations, were also the times when families were most focused on economic planning for the coming year. A young woman might catch a glimpse of someone who stirred her heart during a midsummer festival, only to find herself betrothed to someone else before the autumn planting began. The economic realities of medieval life meant that romantic relationships were constantly vulnerable to external financial pressures. A couple who had managed to find love within an arranged marriage might be torn apart if economic circumstances changed. Crop failures, political upheavals, or trade disruptions could force families to rearrange marriages, separate established couples, or sell children into unions that served immediate economic needs rather than long-term happiness. For those few brave souls who dared to marry for love despite the economic consequences, the punishment was swift and merciless. Families faced social ostracism, economic boycotts, and political retaliation. Communities that harbored romantic rebels found themselves cut off from trade networks, denied access to markets, and excluded from the cooperative relationships that made survival possible in the harsh medieval world. The economic nightmare of medieval romance extended even to the most basic human needs. Food, shelter, clothing, protection. All of these necessities were controlled by family networks that demanded absolute submission to arranged marriage systems. A person who chose love over economic logic wasn't just risking their own comfort. They were risking starvation, homelessness, and death. As we've seen throughout this exploration of medieval romance, the barriers to love weren't just social, religious, or supernatural. They were brutally, inexorably economic. In a world where survival itself required constant calculation and compromise, the luxury of romantic choice was something only the most privileged could even dream of attempting. The medieval economy didn't just constrain romantic choices, it made the very concept of romantic love seem dangerous, selfish, and ultimately meaningless in the face of hunger, poverty, and the constant threat of economic catastrophe. Love, in this harsh world, wasn't just impractical, it was quite literally unaffordable. But even if you managed to navigate the supernatural terrors and religious oppression surrounding medieval romance, you still face perhaps the most insurmountable obstacle of all, the brutal economic realities that turned love into a luxury most simply couldn't afford. In a world where survival itself was a daily struggle, where a bad harvest meant starvation, and where your entire existence was controlled by feudal lords who saw you as barely more than livestock, romantic feelings became secondary to the desperate mathematics of staying alive. For the vast majority of medieval people, who were peasants bound to the land, marriage wasn't about love or even personal choice. It was an economic transaction designed to pool resources and increase the chances that both families might survive another winter. A peasant father didn't ask whether his daughter loved her potential husband. He asked whether the man had enough land to feed her, whether his family owned livestock that could help during planting season, and whether the alliance would provide mutual support during times of crisis. Consider the harsh reality facing a typical peasant family in 14th century England. The father, bound to his lord's estate, worked strips of land that weren't even his own. He owed the lord labour service, usually 3 days a week during planting and harvest seasons, and had to pay various fees and taxes that consumed much of what little he produced. His children faced a future of identical bondage, legally tied to the same land, unable to leave without permission that was rarely granted. In this environment, a daughter's marriage became one of the few opportunities to improve the family's economic position. But this improvement came at a cost that would make modern romantics weep. The girl, often as young as 12 or 13, would be married to whoever offered the best economic arrangement. Her feelings about the match were not just irrelevant. Expressing dissatisfaction could be seen as selfishly endangering her entire family's survival. The dowry system added another layer of economic brutality to medieval romance. Families had to provide substantial payments to secure marriages for their daughters, often bankrupting themselves in the process. A peasant father might work for years to accumulate enough livestock, grain, or silver to make his daughter attractive to potential suitors. And if he couldn't provide an adequate dowry, she might remain unmarried forever, becoming a burden on the family and a source of shame in the community. For young men, the economic pressures were equally crushing, but took different forms. Unless he was the eldest son who would inherit the family's holdings, a young man faced the grim prospect of having nothing to offer a potential bride. Younger sons often had no choice but to remain unmarried, enter the church, or leave their homes to seek their fortunes as soldiers, craftsmen, or labourers in distant towns. The romantic notion of a young man proving himself worthy through love and devotion was meaningless when what actually mattered was whether he owned enough land to support a family. The guild system that controlled most urban trades created additional barriers to romantic freedom. Master craftsmen jealously guarded their economic privileges, often requiring enormous fees and years of unpaid apprenticeship before allowing anyone to establish an independent business. A young baker or weaver might spend a decade working for subsistence wages, unable to afford marriage until he was well into his 30s, if ever. By then, his potential brides had long since been married off to men with better economic prospects. Even among the nobility, where there was theoretically more wealth and freedom, love remained subordinate to economic and political considerations. Noble marriages were diplomatic alliances designed to consolidate lands, secure military partnerships, or end costly conflicts. A duke's daughter wasn't choosing between suitors based on affection. She was being traded like a valuable commodity to cement her father's political relationships. The dowries involved in these arrangements could include entire counties, making the personal preferences of the bride completely irrelevant compared to the territorial gains at stake. The economic framework of medieval society created a vicious cycle that trapped people in loveless relationships. Once married, couples found themselves locked into economic partnerships that made divorce virtually impossible. A woman who left her husband lost access to any means of supporting herself, while a man who abandoned his wife faced legal and economic penalties that could destroy his livelihood. They were bound together not by love, but by economic necessity, forced to make the best of arrangements that might have been repugnant to both parties. The seasonal nature of medieval agricultural life added another dimension to these economic pressures. During planting and harvest times, every available hand was needed in the fields, leaving no time for courtship or romantic pursuits. Young people might meet briefly during religious festivals or market days, but these encounters were heavily supervised and focused on practical considerations rather than emotional connection. The brief winter months when agricultural work slowed offered little relief, as families were often confined together in cramped cold quarters where privacy was impossible and tempers ran short. The constant threat of famine created an atmosphere where long-term planning became almost impossible. Families lived from harvest to harvest, never knowing whether the next year would bring abundance or starvation. In this environment, romantic love seemed like a dangerous indulgence that could distract from the serious business of survival. Parents who allowed their children to marry for love rather than economic advantage were seen as irresponsible, potentially condemning their entire lineage to poverty and death. The church, while preaching about the sanctity of marriage, actually reinforced these economic realities through its own financial demands. Getting married required fees for the ceremony, and the church insisted on elaborate celebrations that further drained family resources. Religious festivals, while offering brief respites from labour, also demanded expensive offerings and participation that families could barely afford. The church's own vast landholdings and economic power made it complicit in the system that reduced marriage to a business transaction. For women especially, the economic realities of medieval life made any form of romantic agency nearly impossible. Without the ability to own property, enter contracts or pursue independent careers, they were entirely dependent on male relatives for survival. A woman who rejected a proposed marriage wasn't just defying social conventions. She was potentially condemning herself to destitution. The few alternatives available, such as entering a convent, required substantial dowries that most families couldn't afford, effectively trapping women in whatever marriages their fathers could arrange. The inheritance laws that governed medieval society created additional barriers to romantic freedom. Property passed from father to eldest son, leaving younger children with little economic power and limited marriage prospects. These laws meant that love matches between people of different economic classes were not just socially unacceptable, but economically impossible. A wealthy merchant's daughter couldn't marry a poor farmer's son without both families facing financial ruin. The rise of money-based economies in later medieval periods actually made these problems worse rather than better. As cash became more important than land or livestock, families needed liquid wealth to arrange marriages and maintain their social positions. This created new forms of economic pressure and made it even more difficult for young people to marry based on affection rather than financial calculation. Military service obligations added another layer of economic complexity to medieval relationships. Young men could be called away for months or years to fight in their lord's wars, leaving behind wives and families with no guarantee of return. The economic disruption caused by these military obligations often forced families to make desperate decisions about marriages and alliances, prioritizing immediate survival over long-term happiness. The Black Death and other plagues that periodically swept through medieval Europe created sudden shifts in economic power that could destroy carefully planned marriage arrangements overnight. Families that had spent years accumulating dowries might find themselves destitute after a plague killed their livestock or destroyed their crops. The survivors faced a transformed economic landscape where old alliances meant nothing, and new arrangements had to be made quickly, often with little regard for personal preferences. Even successful merchants and craftsmen found that their economic prosperity was constantly threatened by political upheavals, trade disruptions, and changing royal policies. A wealthy family could become impoverished practically overnight if their trade routes were disrupted or their guild privileges were revoked. This economic instability made long-term romantic relationships extremely risky, as couples never knew whether they would be able to maintain their standard of living or would find themselves reduced to beggary. The taxation systems that supported medieval kingdoms created additional economic pressures that affected romantic relationships. Lords demanded not only labour service but also various fees and tributes that consumed much of what peasant families produced. These obligations often increased when political circumstances changed, forcing families to adjust their marriage plans and economic strategies accordingly. As we examine these crushing economic realities, it becomes clear that medieval romance was indeed a nightmare, not because people didn't experience love, but because the economic system made it nearly impossible to act on those feelings. Love became a luxury that only the very wealthy could afford, and even then, it was subordinated to political and economic considerations that made genuine romantic freedom almost impossible to achieve. The medieval economic framework didn't just make dating difficult, It made the very concept of romantic choice seem dangerously irresponsible. In a world where survival depended on making practical decisions about marriage and family alliances, following one's heart was seen as a form of selfishness that could endanger entire communities. This economic logic, ruthless but undeniable, turned what should have been life's greatest joy into yet another form of medieval suffering. As we've journeyed through the nightmarish landscape of biblical justice, witnessed the crushing weight of medieval romance, and felt the suffocating grip of supernatural terror, we arrive now at a profound and troubling realization. The very systems that promised protection, salvation, and meaning to our ancestors were themselves engines of oppression, designed not to liberate the human spirit, but to contain it within rigid boundaries of fear and submission. The brutal punishments of biblical times, with their emphasis on swift and public retribution, created a society where mercy was rare and proportional justice was measured in blood and stone. The eye for an eye mentality that governed ancient legal systems wasn't merely about fairness, it was about demonstrating power, about showing entire communities what happened when divine or earthly authority was challenged. These weren't just legal proceedings. They were theatrical displays of dominance, designed to terrify as much as to adjudicate. When we contrast this with our modern approach to justice, we see how far humanity has traveled toward understanding rehabilitation, due process, and the possibility of redemption. Where ancient societies saw punishment as an end in itself, we've slowly learned to view it as one tool among many in the complex work of maintaining social order while preserving human dignity. The transformation from public stonings to private deliberations, from immediate retribution to careful investigation, represents one of civilization's greatest achievements. But even as we've evolved our understanding of justice, the medieval period showed us how completely other aspects of human experience could be corrupted by the marriage of religious orthodoxy and political power. The systematic suppression of romantic love, the transformation of natural human desires into evidence of supernatural corruption, the weaponization of superstition against the vulnerable, all of these represent perhaps the darkest chapter in humanity's relationship with its own emotional and spiritual life. In medieval times, love itself became suspect. The Church taught that passionate affection was a distraction from divine devotion, that physical desire was inherently sinful, that the very feelings that make us most human were also the feelings most likely to damn our souls. This wasn't merely theological doctrine, it was a complete restructuring of human experience, turning the most basic needs for connection and intimacy into sources of guilt and terror. The consequences were devastating. Young people learned to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potentially demonic, to accept loveless arrangements as morally superior to passionate partnerships. Women in particular suffered under this system, as any display of romantic agency or sexual desire could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft or moral corruption. The very qualities that made someone attractive, intelligence, independence, knowledge of herbs or healing, were precisely the traits that medieval society associated with supernatural malevolence. This systematic demonization of love created a culture where genuine intimacy became nearly impossible. Couples, who might have found joy in each other's company instead, lived in constant fear that their feelings were either sinful or artificial, the product of dark magic rather than natural human emotion. The spontaneous joy of new love, the comfort of long partnership, the excitement of mutual attraction, all were tainted by the constant worry that these feelings might be the devil's work. The economic dimensions of this romantic oppression added another layer of cruelty. Marriage wasn't about love or compatibility. It was about consolidating wealth, securing political alliances, and ensuring economic survival. A peasant woman who refused an advantageous marriage in favor of a love match might find herself disinherited and cast out with no means of supporting herself. A young man who pursued a woman above his station might face not only rejection, but also economic retaliation from her family and their allies. Even more insidious was how these medieval attitudes toward love became embedded in our cultural DNA. The idea that passionate love is somehow dangerous or suspect, that female romantic agency is inherently threatening, that successful relationships require explanation beyond natural attraction. These beliefs shaped European culture for generations. We can still find echoes of these medieval terrors in modern anxieties about sexuality, romance, and emotional expression. The superstitious dimension of medieval romance created perhaps the most toxic environment imaginable for human connection. In a world where love magic was believed to be real, where beauty itself was viewed as potentially supernatural, where any unusual romantic development could trigger investigations and accusations, the simple act of falling in love became a potentially life-threatening endeavor. The witch trials that plagued Europe from the medieval period through the early modern era had their roots in these superstitious fears about love and sexuality. Thousands of people, mostly women, were tortured and executed for practicing magic, and a significant proportion of these cases involved accusations of love magic. The systematic persecution of women who were beautiful, charming, or successful in romantic matters wasn't random violence. It was organized campaign to control and suppress romantic feelings through fear. This creates a profound irony. The medieval period, which gave us some of our most enduring romantic literature and imagery, was actually one of the most hostile environments for actual romantic relationships in human history. The courtly love tradition that we often associate with medieval romance was built on the foundation of impossible relationships, celebrating forbidden love precisely because it could never be fulfilled. It was a fantasy that served as a safety valve, allowing people to imagine passionate romance while maintaining the rigid marriage structures that kept society stable. What we see when we examine both biblical justice and medieval romance is how systems of control operate across different spheres of human experience. In the realm of law and punishment, fear was used to maintain order through the threat of severe consequences. In the realm of love and relationships, fear was used to maintain social hierarchies through the threat of spiritual damnation or supernatural accusations. Both systems shared a common feature. They took fundamental human experiences, the need for justice and the need for love, and twisted them into instruments of oppression. They promised protection and salvation, while delivering terror and submission. They claimed to represent divine will, while serving very earthly interests in maintaining power and control. The legacy of these systems extends far beyond their historical periods. The biblical emphasis on retributive justice influenced legal systems for centuries, and we can still see its echoes in modern debates about punishment versus rehabilitation. The medieval demonization of romantic love shaped attitudes towards sexuality and relationships that persisted well into the modern era, and we're still working to overcome the damage done by centuries of teaching people to fear and distrust their own emotions. Understanding this history is crucial for recognizing how systems of oppression operate. They don't announce themselves as evil. They present themselves as necessary, as divinely ordained, as protective of social order and moral values. They take our deepest needs and desires and turn them into sources of fear and control. They promise to save us from chaos while creating new forms of suffering. The transformation from these oppressive systems to more humane approaches didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without struggle. Every step toward a more just legal system, every move toward recognizing romantic autonomy, every effort to separate superstition from law required people to challenge entrenched power structures and deeply held beliefs. The biblical move from immediate retribution to careful investigation, from public spectacle to private deliberation, from punishment as entertainment to justice as responsibility, represents generations of moral and intellectual progress. Similarly, the gradual recognition that love is natural rather than dangerous, that women have the right to romantic agency, that passion can be healthy rather than sinful, required centuries of resistance to religious and social orthodoxy. Yet even as we celebrate this progress, we must remain vigilant. The human tendency to use fear as a tool of control didn't disappear with the medieval period. The impulse to demonize natural human desires in service of social stability continues to manifest in new forms. The desire to create scapegoats for complex social problems, whether through accusations of witchcraft in the past or moral panics in the present, remains a constant threat to human dignity and freedom. The stories we've explored, from the brutal efficiency of ancient justice to the romantic nightmares of medieval Europe, serve as reminders of how quickly human societies can lose their way, how easily fear can be weaponized against the vulnerable, how dangerous it is when religious certainty combines with political power. They show us that progress is not inevitable, that the freedoms we take for granted were hard-won and remain fragile. As we drift towards sleep, surrounded by the comforts and securities that our ancestors could hardly imagine, we might reflect on the courage of those who lived through these dark periods. The people who found ways to love despite the terror, who maintained their humanity despite the dehumanizing systems around them, who preserved hope and connection even when such feelings were literally criminalized. Their struggles were not in vain. Every act of quiet resistance, every moment of genuine human connection in the face of systematic oppression, every choice to trust love over fear contributed to the slow work of human liberation. The world we inhabit, imperfect as it is, represents the cumulative result of countless individual decisions to choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over ignorance, love over fear. The nightmares of the past need not define our future. The systems that once seemed permanent and unchangeable have given way to more humane approaches. The progress we've made in understanding justice, in recognizing the value of romantic autonomy, in separating superstition from law, proves that human societies can evolve, can learn, can become more just and more loving. But this evolution is not automatic. It requires constant vigilance, constant effort, constant willingness to challenge systems that claim divine authority while serving earthly interests. It requires us to remember the lessons of history, to recognize the patterns of oppression when they emerge in new forms, to stand with the vulnerable against those who would use fear as a weapon. The biblical world of swift and brutal justice, the medieval landscape of romantic terror and supernatural accusation, these aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders of what human societies can become when fear triumphs over compassion, when power is valued more than truth, when the preservation of order becomes more important than the protection of human dignity. As we close this exploration of humanity's darkest chapters, we do so not with despair, but with determination. The people who suffered under these systems, who were stoned for adultery or burned for witchcraft or forced into loveless marriages, their pain was not meaningless. Their stories serve as warnings, as guideposts, as reminders of the price of allowing fear to govern human relationships. We honor their memory by continuing the work they began, by building societies that value justice over vengeance, love over control, truth over superstition. We honor them by refusing to let fear make us cruel, by choosing understanding over ignorance, by protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. The long arc of human history, despite its many dark chapters, bends toward justice, toward love, toward the recognition of human dignity. The nightmares of biblical punishment and medieval romance are behind us, but their lessons remain. We are the inheritors of both the suffering and the wisdom of the past, charged with the responsibility of creating a future worthy of those who endured so much to bring us to this moment. In that responsibility lies both challenge and hope. The challenge of remaining vigilant against the return of oppressive systems, the hope that human societies can continue to evolve toward greater justice and greater love. The choice, as always, is ours. As we reach the end of this journey, through the darkest chapters of human justice and social control, it becomes clear that the chasm between biblical times and our modern world of 2025 is nothing short of extraordinary. The transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it a simple linear progression from darkness to light. Instead, it represents centuries of struggle, enlightenment, and the gradual recognition that human dignity must be the cornerstone of any just society. Consider for a moment the incredible shift in how we approach criminal justice today. Where biblical law demanded an eye for an eye, our modern courts in 2025 focus on rehabilitation, mental health assessment, and restorative justice. Instead of dragging offenders to the city gates for public execution, we have sophisticated legal systems with multiple appeals processes, public defenders, and an entire infrastructure designed to ensure fair treatment. The electronic monitoring systems that house arrest offenders today would seem like magic to ancient peoples, yet they represent a profound evolution in thinking about punishment and human worth. The contrast becomes even more striking when we examine how we treat the most vulnerable members of society. In biblical times, women accused of adultery faced brutal death by stoning, their fate decided by male accusers with little regard for evidence or circumstance. Today, while domestic violence and sexual assault remain serious challenges, we have specialized courts, victim advocates, and a growing understanding of trauma-informed justice. The Me Too movement and similar social changes have fundamentally altered how we approach these issues, prioritizing the voices of survivors in ways that would have been unthinkable in ancient times. Perhaps nowhere is this evolution more evident than in our treatment of mental health and what was once considered supernatural influence. Medieval societies burned people alive for witchcraft, often targeting individuals who were likely suffering from mental illness, epilepsy, or simply non-conformity. In 2025, we have comprehensive mental health courts, crisis intervention teams, and a growing recognition that many behaviors once attributed to demonic possession or moral failing are actually symptoms of treatable conditions. The exorcisms and trials by ordeal of the past have given way to therapy, medication, and support systems that aim to heal rather than destroy. The economic factors that once made love a luxury have also undergone revolutionary change. While inequality certainly persists, the rigid class structures that forced marriages to be mere economic transactions have largely dissolved in the developed world. Dating apps, social media, and global connectivity have created possibilities for romantic connection that transcend the geographical and social boundaries that once seemed insurmountable. Young people today can choose their partners based on compatibility and affection rather than their father's business arrangements or feudal obligations. Yet as we celebrate this progress, we must also acknowledge the ongoing challenges that echo these ancient struggles. The rise of surveillance technology, while used for legitimate law enforcement, also raises questions about privacy and state power that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Social media, despite enabling connection, has also created new forms of public shaming and mob justice that bear uncomfortable resemblances to the town square executions of biblical times. The cancel culture phenomenon, while often addressing legitimate grievances, sometimes exhibits the same rush to judgment and disproportionate punishment that characterized ancient justice systems. The persistence of authoritarian regimes around the world reminds us that the brutal punishments we've explored didn't disappear everywhere on Earth. In some regions, public executions, stoning, and other forms of extreme punishment continue to this day, serving as stark reminders that the progress we've made is neither universal nor guaranteed. The digital age has even enabled new forms of these ancient practices, with public humiliation and social destruction now possible on a global scale through online platforms. Religious extremism continues to manifest in ways that echo the medieval church's control over love and relationships. Honor killings, forced marriages, and the persecution of LGBTQ+ individuals in various parts of the world demonstrate that the struggle between institutional control and individual freedom remains very much alive. The same impulses that led to witch trials and public executions now express themselves through different but equally destructive means. Even in the most progressive societies, we see shadows of these ancient patterns. The prison industrial complex in some countries has created systems where punishment becomes profitable, potentially distorting the very justice it claims to serve. The tendency toward harsh sentencing for non-violent crimes, particularly those related to drug use, sometimes reflects the same retributive thinking that drove biblical justice systems. The lessons from this dark history are not merely academic exercises, but urgent warnings for our contemporary world. The ease with which fear can be weaponized, the speed at which communities can turn against individuals, and the danger of allowing institutions to gain too much control over personal relationships remain relevant threats. Social media lynch mobs, political persecution, and the use of technology for social control all demonstrate that the fundamental human tendencies we've explored haven't disappeared, but have simply found new expressions. What gives us hope, however, is the recognition that progress is possible and that human beings are capable of learning from their mistakes. The very fact that we can look back at biblical and medieval justice systems with horror rather than nostalgia demonstrates how far we've come. The development of human rights concepts, international law, and global communication has created frameworks for holding societies accountable in ways that were impossible in earlier eras. The resilience of the human spirit, evident throughout history, continues to manifest in modern movements for justice and equality. From civil rights activism to prison reform advocates, from domestic violence counselors to mental health professionals, millions of people dedicate their lives to ensuring that the dark patterns of the past don't repeat themselves. This collective effort represents perhaps the most significant difference between our age and those we've examined. As we close this exploration of humanity's journey from the brutal justice of biblical times to the imperfect but evolving systems of 2025, we're reminded that vigilance is the price of progress. The same human nature that enabled the cruelties we've described also possesses the capacity for growth, compassion, and wisdom. The challenge for our generation and those that follow is to remain aware of these historical lessons while continuing to build systems that honor human dignity, protect the vulnerable, and promote genuine justice. As we drift toward the end of this exploration through time, it becomes clear that the journey from biblical brutality to modern mercy represents one of humanity's most profound transformations. The stark contrast between then and now reveals not just different approaches to punishment, but entirely different philosophies about what it means to be human. In biblical times, justice was immediate, harsh, and often permanent. A thief might lose a hand, an adulterer could face stoning, and entire communities would gather to witness these spectacles of divine retribution. The goal was simple: make the punishment so terrifying that others would never dare commit similar crimes. Pain was the teacher, Fear was the curriculum, and death was often the final exam. Today's justice system, while imperfect, operates on fundamentally different principles. We've moved from asking, how can we make them suffer, to how can we make this right? Rehabilitation programs, mental health support, and restorative justice practices reflect our growing understanding that crime often stems from deeper societal issues rather than simple moral failings. We've learned that healing communities requires more than inflicting pain. The evolution of love and relationships tells a similar story. Medieval societies turned natural human affection into a dangerous game where women could be burned as witches for brewing love potions, and men could face exile for pursuing forbidden romance. Love was filtered through economic arrangements, religious doctrine, and social hierarchies that treated human hearts as commodities to be controlled rather than celebrated. Modern society has largely freed love from these ancient shackles. We can choose our partners based on genuine connection rather than family arrangements or social status. While challenges remain, the fundamental right to love authentically is now protected by law rather than punished by it. Yet, as we've seen throughout history, progress is never guaranteed. The same human tendencies that created brutal punishments and oppressive systems still exist within us. Fear, superstition, and the desire for control haven't disappeared. They've simply found new forms of expression. Social media shaming, cancel culture, and political polarization sometimes echo the mob mentality of ancient stone-throwing crowds. The lesson isn't that we're inherently better than our ancestors, but that we've collectively chosen to build systems that appeal to our better angels rather than our darker impulses. Every generation must actively choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over judgment, and rehabilitation over revenge. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember that the comfortable world we inhabit didn't happen by accident. It was built by countless individuals who decided that mercy was stronger than vengeance, that love was more powerful than fear, and that every human being deserved dignity regardless of their mistakes. Sweet dreams, and may tomorrow bring even more progress toward the light.